Greetings everyone, Melderon here. Well, Classic WoW, hopefully the first iteration of Classic WoW, is coming to an end. Kel'Thuzad and the forces of Naxxramas have been stopped, at least for now, and we, collectively as a community, focus our eyes towards the Blasted Lands and the Dark Portal, as later this month, we expect to hear an announcement of a classic version of the Burning Crusade at Virtual BlizzCon. But what about fresh classic servers? Is that outside of the realm of possibility? I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I'm betting we will hear that Blizzard will continue to provide vanilla classic servers as long as interest persists, and I do think that interest will persist. Of course, it won't be at the level we experienced this past year and a half, but enough interest should remain to allow for a few servers per region. At this point, we've experienced the no changes version of Classic WoW. Sure, there were some inconsistencies, but for better or for worse, we have all tasted what vanilla truly means. However, if we do get fresh classic servers, I bet that most people would like to see some things changed. Removal of spell batching, leeway, phase 2 open world honor grinding, dungeon boosting, GDKP normalization, and a harsh stance on body and RMT are the big changes I like to see for sure. But there is one aspect of the game that in my opinion negatively affects the game the most, and that's world buffs. It's been over a year and a half since I made a video entitled Are World Buffs an Exploit?, where I, with an amazing script written by Taladrill, explain why world buffs are a significant gameplay exploit that trivialize endgame content, foster poor gameplay and community interaction, and provide a toxic raid environment. Now, in retrospect, I can say that I have experienced all of those negative aspects. World buffs have hampered my gameplay in many ways, whether it be not playing my main when I want to, being griefed by the opposing faction, seeing fellow guildies quit the game after losing buffs, and feeling the morale of a raid completely turn after a wipe. And to those viewers saying, well then just don't get them. It's not a realistic option. Due to the performance metrics that world buffs allow, it is near impossible to maintain a stable guild where world buffs aren't a part of the culture. This is primarily due to serious raiders completely disregarding guilds that don't at least heavily recommend world buffs, let alone require them, making recruitment extremely difficult. As I said in the video I made a year and a half ago, the world buff effect seeps into every guild. As soon as one person gets them, then the tanks have to because of threat. And at the same time, other raiders will follow suit as they want to compete and stay relevant. Soon enough, the entire guild gets them. Many guilds have tried to take a nonchalant stance on world buffs, even mine, but eventually, they become the norm. Players would rather compete than play their main characters normally. Players would rather spend time and gold acquiring these buffs, rather than just experience the content how it was meant to be done. I should know. I'm one of them. To be completely fair, that doesn't mean world buffs are all bad. They add additional challenges for all players. As examples, healers need to protect those that still have world buffs, and DPS and tanking classes, in addition to protecting themselves, can use different gear loadouts and talent options that normally aren't viable or recommended. Also, they breed more competition. However, when you take all the pros and cons together, I still feel that world buffs lead to significantly more negatives than positives. I know I went over all those pros and cons rather quickly, so if you want to know my full stance, watch the video. I'll link it in the description below. Okay, so now you're expecting me to say, I told you so. I said this would be a problem in Classic WoW. If we want Fresh Classic to be a better version of the game, we need these buffs removed. Actually, no. I don't actually believe that anymore. At least not 100%. Let me explain why. I was fully ready to make this video lambasting world buffs, explaining that all they do is bring out the worst in people and make a wonderful game miserable. But that was until I fully experienced one of the greatest raids ever made, Naxxramas. Before Naxx, the content is honestly kind of a joke. MC, BWL, and AQ40 may have been challenging the first couple weeks they came out, but these raids were accessible and beatable for the vast majority of classic guilds. Leaving world buffs out of the equation, due to the combined knowledge of 15 years and the talents and itemization of 1.12, the content was heavily trivialized. I mean, when MC first came out, mages didn't even have Winter's Chill or Elemental Precision. Warriors didn't have Bloodthirst or Dual Wield specialization. Just think about that for a second. Sure, there are perhaps some challenging bosses in AQ, but to me, there is no reason why guilds can't down this content without world buffs. Especially since the mechanics in these raids have been dealt with over and over again in the first iteration of Classic. Naxx, however, is a different animal. It really belongs in a league all its own. There is a significant difficulty step between AQ40 and Naxxramas due to many reasons. Some examples are, tanks need to itemize for mitigation over threat on many encounters. If you want to know more about what I mean on this specific point, check out a video our main tank Navik made. The link will be in the description below. Melee stacking doesn't work well for a number of fights due to debuff control. Many classes are asked to do things they aren't normally asked to do, especially priests and DPS warriors. Healers need to worry much more about itemization in terms of mana efficiency. Saffron, and to a lesser degree Kel'Thuzad, are true progression checks, requiring frost resistance gear from earlier in the raid to successfully complete, and most importantly, the level of personal responsibility of raiders is much higher. Examples of this are 1 missed heal on Loeth Ever Patchwork, or 1 missed polarity shift on Thaddeus. Overall, the raid is much more engaging and requires more mental input than any other raid before it. Because of this, world buffs actually provide a strategic advantage in Naxxramas, and for many guilds are, even now, 2 months after launch, required for progression. To put it simply, many bosses feel completely different with and without world buffs. If you've done Saffron without world buffs and then with buffs, you'll know exactly what I mean. Of course, you could say this for any boss in the game, but shortening an encounter in AQ40 and BWL by 10 or 15 seconds is not the same thing as having to execute at peak performance raid-wide for substantially longer with less of a health buffer. And due to the mechanics of bosses like Patchwork and Kel'Thuzad, RNG can be devastating. Here, world buffs provide a cushion for randomness in the game, whereas world buffs before Naxx primarily provide a cushion for human error. The fights are just designed better, and test every member of your guild equally. TLDR, world buffs are kinda cool in Naxxramas, and they foster much more strategy and thought in a raid that is non-linear with interesting mechanics. Okay, I finished my Naxx spiel. Where does this leave us with world buffs? Do we keep them in just because Naxx is actually engaging and challenging? Yes and no. I recently was on a podcast called Warcraft Reloaded, where myself and the host discussed this very topic. I highly recommend listening to Warcraft Reloaded. The hosts Blazin' Bob, Mellerina, and Cognitive Pit provide an excellent all-encompassing view of Classic WoW at large. A link to the specific episode I'm referencing and the podcast itself are in the description below. At around the 51-minute mark, our discussion shifts towards the topic of world buffs in fresh vanilla servers, and a number of interesting points and arguments are brought up, which I will outline now. Keep in mind that any combination of these points could be viable options for Fresh Classic. 1. Remove world buffs completely from Fresh Classic. World buffs can still exist, but they will be removed once entering a raid instance. World buffs provide extra flavor into the game and could still be enjoyed for leveling, PvP, and 5-man content. This is what I argued for a year and a half ago in my video. However, one interesting point that Mellerina brought up was, would you still play the same class? Bob, who currently mains a warrior, said he wouldn't and would likely play a rogue. I completely understand this point. As someone who plays warriors and alt, world buffs make warriors feel completely different. You basically feel like the Incredible Hulk with them and a baked potato without them. So it is very possible that the removal of world buffs could skew the class distribution of Fresh Vanilla Classic. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. But I have to agree with Bob. I would definitely think much more deeply about selecting a melee class as a main if world buffs are removed. Option 2. Keep buffs in the game, but lock them behind a gold sink. Essentially, this means that buffs will be available from one or more NPCs in major cities at a cost. The cost of buffs would be substantial, as it will provide the buff for the entire server, so this will likely only be accessible to entire guilds or coalition of guilds. Of course, a variant of this would be to make world buffs cheaper and only provide buffs to the person actually buying them, removing the server-wide cooldown attached to the buffs. For this to work, individual buff cooldowns would have to be implemented for each player. This already exists for the Sayge Darkmoon Fair buffs, which require the player to stay logged in for a total of 4 hours or logged out for a total of 12 hours to remove the cooldown. This could easily be implemented to all the other buffs in the game. Overall, locking world buffs behind a gold sink is an interesting option as it can create more in-game interaction between players and guilds, or if personally associated, allows players to get buffs right before raid. This is much better in my opinion than if done server-wide, as if buff cooldowns remain server-wide, it does not change the fact you'll have to raid log on your main character. This is an issue that I think needs to be rectified in a Fresh Classic if world buffs remain in the game with server-based cooldowns. Option 3. Time gate world buffs for progression only. This was an option used by some private servers as the first couple weeks of progression in a new raid tier are of course the most challenging. This to me is a good option as it caps the effect of world buffs to a certain time interval. After that point, they are still accessible in game but will wipe from players upon entering a raid. To me, this gets to the problem and allows players the peace of mind to know that world buff meta is short-lived and will eventually come to an end. Option 4. Keep world buffs as is, but make them undispellable. A significant portion of the world buff headache, if you will, is spending time getting them just to have them dispelled by an enemy priest or shaman. Currently, Songflower Serenade and the Dire Maul Tribute buffs are all dispellable. The mere fact that these buffs are dispellable creates a cesspool of player interaction based around griefing, not actual skill-based PvP. As far as I'm concerned, if you can kill me, then you deserve to take my buffs away. Otherwise, it's just griefing. Of course, the argument can be made that a group of players that want to kill another group of players just due to world buffs is also griefing, and that is a perfectly valid opinion. However, rectifying this would mean world buffs would give you some kind of invincibility, and that is just out of the question. If this is an issue to you, a PvE server is a better option. I think this, in combination with point 2, would make world buffs a lot less painful. However, in my opinion, there is a better option. Option 5. World buffs are only raid accessible for Naxxramas. This is the conclusion we came to in the podcast. In each of the aforementioned points, there are issues that make them less than ideal. In option 1, world buffs are gone, but as I said in the beginning of the video, are definitely welcome in Naxxramas, as a significant portion of guilds still struggle week to week, even now. In option 2, world buffs are available to either individual players or the server as a whole, less painfully, requiring no travel. However, buffs are still available for raids that don't, in my opinion, require them, trivializing the content, and furthermore, still allow for significant griefing and cross-faction collusion. In option 3, with time-gated world buffs, we get back to the same issue with Naxx. Guilds still need world buffs in Naxx, even 2 months after launch. And finally, with option 4, buffs are protected as they are non-dispellable. However, they will still heavily trivialize the earlier raids. Instead, by taking a bit of each of the previous options, I think I formulated a way that will both make players' lives easier and respect the content as a whole. Imagine if world buffs still exist in the game before Phase 6, can be acquired normally, are still dispellable, but are removed from players as they enter a raid. In other words, option 1, Untitled Naxxramas. However, once Naxxramas is launched, all of the game's world buffs are accessible either directly inside or directly outside Naxxramas itself via a number of NPCs. The buffs would have the same cooldown as Darkmoon Faire, 4 hours in-game or 12 hours logged out. This just ensures that guilds won't just rebuff directly after a wipe, and because of this will require strategic pulling and thought about which wings to do first. If you run for more than 4 hours, you can of course rebuff, or save harder bosses for the next raid day. If the buffs are outside, the chance of PvP interaction is still there. I can imagine entire guilds fighting outside to keep their buffs. However, of course, this could spawn some toxic behavior, so the better option in my opinion would be to put these NPCs directly inside the raid. Think of the Argent Crusade NPCs in the beginning of Icecrown Citadel during Wrath of the Lich King. Of course, these could be random Argent Dawn NPCs for things like Songflower, but imagine if the Horde and Alliance NPCs, the Zandalar Trolls, the Ogres of Dire Maw, and Sayge from Darkmoon Faire are all there. Considering that Kel'Thuzad and the Scourge represent a significant threat to all of Azeroth, it isn't unbelievable that these NPCs would want to help you and your allies stop the forces of Naxxramas. I think this could make for some interesting immersion and add gravity to the task that lies before you as a raider. Overall, I believe this is the best option as it hits all the major points. The first is, it doesn't trivialize earlier raids. Raids that, in my opinion, world buffs just help destroy. You don't even get to see most mechanics with world buffs in these raids. Point 2, it allows players to see all of the content. A big philosophy of Blizzard games is allowing most, if not all, of players to experience as much of the content as possible. We can meme about LFR all day, but this is why it was implemented. However, in a version of World of Warcraft without raid difficulty, a good way to do this is to provide buffs to assist players who may need it. Believe it or not, this isn't a new thing for Blizzard. During the podcast, Cognitive Pit pointed out that during Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard actually implemented zone-wide buffs in Icecrown Citadel that increased in effect over time. Here's a screenshot of how this buff was implemented. As you can see, each of these dates the buff got more powerful. This is the Horde version just for show, but there was an Alliance version as well. As you can see, there is a history for this type of behavior, lending more credence to Blizzard actually implementing something like this in Fresh Classic. Point 3, it alleviates or removes any world buff griefing. Of course, people could still grief people getting buffs in the world for leveling, PvP, and dungeons, but the incentive to remove world buffs from a lobby or someone just doing a 5-man with some friends is much less. The removal of toxic behavior due to world buff griefing would be a welcome addition to the game. Point 4, it places everyone on the same playing field. Before Naxxramas, the ability to get world buffs for raids wouldn't be possible, leveling the playing field and stressing more importance on consumables and gear. And in Naxx, world buffs will be available to everyone, making the only true difference in effectiveness based entirely on skill and preparedness, and not based on access to world buffs. And finally, it allows players to play their main characters whenever they want. With this change, no more raid logging. The world will feel more alive as high levels and alts alike will fill the major cities and world. All in all, I think option 5 is the best to keep Fresh Classic servers more engaging and healthy. A change like this, in combination with reductions in botting, RMT, and boosting, will make Azeroth more lively. People will run dungeons again. Max level characters won't have to be logged out for days on end, making real PvP more of a possibility. And endgame content will be more relaxing and require a bit more strategy. All of these things collectively will make Fresh Classic a better experience overall. In my opinion, world buffs do far more to hinder the player experience than to help it, at least before Naxxramas' release. However, during Naxxramas, they will allow more players to see the content and provide a fun and engaging way to foster thought and strategy. To me, that's a win-win for the community and a win-win for Blizzard. As with all of my opinion pieces, I like to hear what you think. Do Do you think option 5 makes the most sense, or would you like to see another option, or perhaps some combination of the options? Let me know in the comments section below. And Blizz, if you're listening, please take some time to think about world buffs if you're going to do fresh classic servers. The relative health and longevity of fresh classic servers rely on endgame content being as engaging as possible. Keep on keep on and grinding, everyone. And I hope to see you in fresh classic.